In the narrow lanes of medieval towns, where rubbish piled in corners and grain was stored in wooden bins, a small shadow often slipped by unnoticed: the rat. Quick, clever, and endlessly multiplying, rats became an unwanted part of daily life. And where rats thrived, someone had to deal with them. That someone was the town rat catcher, a strange but necessary figure whose odd profession kept the streets, markets, and homes from being entirely overrun. Who were these men? How did they catch the swift and cunning creatures that plagued every settlement? And what place did they hold in the community that needed them, yet often shunned them? Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will move slowly through this peculiar story, the tools, the tricks, and the quiet life of those who chased rats through the heart of Europe's towns. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more calm journeys into the overlooked corners of history. To understand the strange occupation of the rat catcher, we must first understand the world he lived in, a world where rats were not hidden intruders, but visible companions in daily life. Medieval towns were alive with sound and smell, the ringing of bells, the clatter of carts, the cries of sellers in markets, the chatter of children playing in alleyways. Yet beneath and among these familiar rhythms scurried another presence. Rats darted between walls, slipped under doors, and gnawed at the edges of sacks and storerooms. They were as much a part of the town as cats, dogs, or pigeons, though far less welcome. The physical structure of medieval towns made them perfect habitats. Streets were narrow, often barely wide enough for two carts to pass. Houses leaned close together, their upper stories nearly touching. Waste disposal was rudimentary. Refuse was tossed into gutters, chamber pots emptied into alleys, animal droppings left to dry in the sun. Markets, brimming with fish, grain, and meat, left behind scraps that quickly attracted vermin. Grain was stored in wooden bins or sacks, easy for sharp teeth to pierce. Water supplies, drawn from wells or streams, often ran beside heaps of rubbish. To a rat, the medieval town was a paradise of shelter and food. Rats bred quickly, their litters multiplying in dark corners of warehouses, stables, and kitchens. A single pair could produce dozens of offspring within a year. Families living in cramped wooden houses sometimes heard the scratching of claws above the ceiling or beneath the floor. Bakers found nibbled loaves, brewers discovered gnawed casks, and innkeepers had to guard against rats stealing crumbs from benches. For poorer households, where food supplies were already meager, the loss of even a small portion to rats was serious. The relationship between townspeople and rats was complex. On one hand, rats were despised. Their presence meant stolen grain, spoiled food, and chewed clothing. They spread fleas and disease, though this was not understood at the time. People only knew that sickness often followed where rats thrived. On the other hand, rats were so common that they became a fact of life. Much like bad weather, they could not be eliminated entirely, only endured or controlled. Children sometimes chased them for sport, while adults cursed them and set traps. Cats, of course, played a role in controlling rat numbers. Many towns kept cats for precisely this reason, and they were often valued members of households, barns, and granaries. But cats alone could not stem the tide. Rats were clever, finding spaces cats could not reach, and their numbers often outpaced the hunters. Dogs too were used, particularly terriers bred for ratting. Yet still the problem persisted. When infestations grew too large, when grain stores were threatened, or when disease seemed to follow the vermin, towns turned to specialists, the rat catchers. The need for rat catchers reveals how visible the rodent problem truly was. Unlike today, where sanitation and infrastructure keep rats largely hidden, medieval towns wore their weaknesses openly. Every pile of refuse, every damp cellar, every grain sack left in a corner was an invitation. People lived close to their food and their waste alike, and rats bridged the gap. They were not an occasional nuisance, but a constant adversary. Chroniclers sometimes mention rats in their descriptions of urban life. Accounts of famines often speak of rats devouring stores of grain. Reports of plagues note how vermin scuttled through abandoned houses. In some stories, rats became symbols of corruption, representing the decay of morals or the decline of order. But to ordinary townsfolk, they were less metaphor than reality. Gnawing teeth that left holes in bread, scratching noises that disturbed sleep, shadows that scattered when a lantern was raised. The presence of rats also carried economic consequences. Merchants storing goods in warehouses risked losses when sacks were chewed open. Ships arriving in harbors sometimes unloaded not only cargo but swarms of vermin that spread quickly into town streets. Bakers and brewers had to take constant precautions, not always successfully. The damage was so common that it became an accepted cost of business. Yet for smaller traders and poorer families, even minor losses could mean hardship, making rat control essential. Social attitudes toward rats were shaped by this constant struggle. They were seen as dirty, destructive, and unwelcome, yet their persistence gave them a certain dark respect. People noted their cleverness, their ability to find food and survive in the harshest conditions. Some even believed rats carried messages or omens, their sudden appearance in large numbers a sign of misfortune. Folk tales turned them into tricksters, symbols of greed or cunning. Thus, rats lived not only in houses and barns, but also in the imagination of townspeople. Religious interpretations sometimes linked rats with sin or punishment. Just as locusts devoured crops in biblical plagues, so too did rats swarm through towns when people strayed from moral order, or so some preachers claimed. Such explanations may have added to the fear, but they did little to solve the problem. Practical measures were always needed, and this is where the town rat catcher came into play. The life of the medieval town, then, was inseparable from the life of rats. Their presence shaped diets, economies, fears, and even stories. They scurried in the shadows of markets, gnawed in the silence of night, and darted through the corners of every household. To live in a medieval town was to share space, unwillingly, with rats. And it was in this shared, uneasy coexistence that the peculiar figure of the rat catcher found his purpose. He was called when infestations grew too large, when the scratching in walls grew too loud, when merchants feared for their grain, or when townsfolk whispered of sickness following the vermin. His tools, his tricks, and his reputation made him both necessary and unsettling. But before we explore his craft, we must remember, his work existed only because rats were everywhere, shaping the daily lives of medieval towns. Without the constant scratching, the gnawing teeth, the stolen crumbs, the town rat catcher would have had no trade. Thus, in the backdrop of church bells, market cries, and cartwheels on cobbles, the rat was always present. And in response, so too was the man who made a living chasing them. In the layered fabric of medieval and early modern towns, every occupation had its place. There were bakers who fed the people, smiths who forged their tools, tanners who prepared their leather, and weavers who clothed them. Among these trades, less visible but equally necessary, stood the town rat catcher. His work was neither celebrated nor honored with guild processions, yet it was indispensable. To understand the full role of the rat catcher in society, we must look at how towns viewed him, how they relied upon him, and how he occupied a space both inside and outside the respectability of urban life. The rat catcher was, first and foremost, a man of necessity. Rats posed a threat to food security, public health, and civic order. Without grain, bread could not be baked, and without bread, townspeople starved. Vermin gnawed holes through sacks, spread fleas and lice, and spoiled stores. When food was scarce, every mouthful mattered, and rats consumed what humans could ill afford to lose. The town rat catcher was hired because he alone had the skill and the courage to enter infested cellars, crawl into the dark corners of barns, and pull vermin out from under floors. His status in society was unusual. He was not always despised, yet rarely was he admired. Many townspeople considered his trade dirty, for he dealt daily with creatures associated with filth and decay. The rat catcher's clothes often carried the smell of his work. His hands bore the marks of bites and scratches. He might be given wages by the town council, but he was seldom invited to the feasts of the guilds. He lived on the margins of civic pride, tolerated more than celebrated. Yet in times of crisis, his importance rose dramatically. When infestations threatened food supplies or disease spread, rat catchers became essential. Merchants whose warehouses were plagued with vermin called on him urgently. Councils who feared public unrest paid him handsomely to bring back evidence of his success, sacks of dead rats displayed as proof of his labor. In such moments, the rat catcher shifted from marginal figure to unlikely guardian of the town's survival. The rat catcher also embodied a paradox, both reviled and relied upon. People distrusted him because of the creatures he handled, yet they depended on him to keep those same creatures in check. He was a liminal character, walking between the ordinary life of the town and the shadowed spaces of filth where others would not go. In this sense, he resembled other low-status yet necessary workers, such as executioners, gravediggers, or tanners. His work was needed but not celebrated, essential but socially awkward. Because rats spread quickly, the rat catcher's role often extended beyond individual households. He worked in granaries, docks, and markets, the lifelines of towns. Grain brought in by ship or cart could introduce new infestations, so councils sometimes employed rat catchers to inspect cargo and protect civic stores. In some places, they worked alongside inspectors of bread, ale, and meat, forming part of the network that guarded public health before such concepts were formally recognized. His presence helped prevent scarcity, theft, and unrest, even if few gave him thanks. The tools and methods of the rat catcher added to his social identity. He carried traps, cages, and sacks filled with his captures. Some used dogs trained to hunt rats, small terriers that darted into holes and dragged out the squealing prey. Others relied on ferrets, slipped into burrows to flush vermin out. Still others wielded poisons, mixtures of herbs or minerals that lured and killed rats. Townspeople watched his craft with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Children peered into his cages, adults wrinkled noses at the smell, but all acknowledged his strange skill. Superstition clung to the rat catcher as well. Because he dealt with creatures associated with death and decay, some thought he possessed unusual powers. Rumors suggested he could summon rats as well as kill them, that he knew secret whistles or charms that drew vermin from hiding. These whispers, whether believed or not, set him apart. In folklore, he merged with the figure of the piper, a man whose music led rats away. Reality and legend blurred, and the rat catcher's role grew larger than life. Economically, the rat catcher was often precarious. His work depended on outbreaks, infestations, or contracts from councils. When rats multiplied, he was needed. When they were few, he might struggle for employment. Some supplemented their income by catching moles, crows, or other pests. Others sold the skins of rats for use in trimming cheap garments, or even sold live rats for baiting dogs in taverns. Such practices reinforced the sense that his trade was unsavory, hovering near the edges of respectability. Yet in spite of all this, the rat catcher's role was bound up with survival. He was one of the few figures who entered the unseen spaces of the town, the dark attics, the damp cellars, the refuse heaps behind taverns. He knew the hidden geography of vermin better than anyone. While priests tended the soul and physicians tended the body, the rat catcher tended the very conditions of daily life. Without him, food spoiled faster, filth accumulated. and infestations grew unchecked, we can imagine how townspeople must have viewed him when he appeared in the marketplace with a sack of dead rats slung over his shoulder. Some turned away in disgust. Others looked on with grim satisfaction, knowing that for every rat displayed, a handful of grain was spared. He embodied both revulsion and relief. His trade reminded the town of its constant vulnerability, yet it also showed that steps could be taken, however small, against the tide of vermin. In this way, the rat catcher held an ambiguous but enduring role in society. He was a figure of necessity, called upon in times of need, kept at a distance in times of calm. His work was dirty, his status low, but his presence essential. Without him, the medieval town would have been overrun not only by rats, but by the fear and disorder they represented. With him, there was at least a measure of control, a fragile boundary between order and infestation. Thus, the rat catcher stands as a reminder that history is not only shaped by kings and wars, but also by the odd and overlooked trades that sustain daily life. His role was humble, even unpleasant, but it kept the balance of the town intact. In every sack of dead vermin, in every emptied trap, lay a fragment of security for a community struggling against forces both natural and unseen. The life of the rat catcher was defined not only by his odd occupation, but also by the curious assortment of instruments he carried. His tools were both practical devices for hunting vermin and symbols of his strange place in society. Each object told a story of ingenuity born from necessity, of trial and error in dark corners of granaries, inns, and marketplaces. To reconstruct the rat catcher's toolkit is to step closer to his daily world, where survival depended on quick wits, steady hands, and a willingness to crawl into the filth others avoided. The simplest tool was the trap. Rat catchers used wooden boxes with spring mechanisms or sliding doors triggered by bait. The design was basic but effective. A rat, lured by the smell of grain, cheese, or grease, entered, touched a lever, and found the exit sealed. Some traps captured live rats, useful for showing evidence of work or for selling to taverns where dog ratting contests took place. Others killed instantly, using sharp metal bars or weighted doors. Townspeople often recognized the rat catcher by the cages he carried, the squeaks of trapped vermin echoing as he walked the streets. Another essential companion was the dog, particularly terriers. Small, agile, and bred for hunting, terriers darted into holes, seized rats in their teeth, and shook them violently. Rat catchers trained their dogs carefully, rewarding them for quick kills and teaching them to ignore distractions in busy streets. A skilled dog could dispatch dozens of rats in an hour, turning a rat-infested barn into a battlefield of fur and teeth. For many rat catchers, their dogs were not only tools, but partners, valued above any trap or poison. Ferrets were also employed, slipped into burrows to flush rats out of hiding. Their slender bodies and relentless curiosity made them perfect for chasing vermin through walls and cellars. The rat catcher would block all but one hole, release the ferret, and wait as panic drove the rats into waiting nets or the jaws of dogs. Ferrets, however, were difficult to manage, requiring care and feeding, and they carried their own pungent scent that clung to the rat catcher's clothing. Still, for stubborn infestations, they were indispensable. Poisons formed another part of the trade, though their use was both risky and controversial. Recipes varied. Some mixed herbs like hellebore or aconite with food. Others used mineral substances such as arsenic or quicklime. These poisons killed rats effectively, but could also endanger pets, livestock, or even children. Town councils sometimes banned certain poisons, fearing accidents. Yet in desperate times, when infestations threatened famine, rat catchers employed whatever worked. The preparation and application of poison gave them an aura of dangerous knowledge, further setting them apart from ordinary townsfolk. The rat catcher's sack was a tool in itself. Made of coarse cloth or leather, it was used to carry traps, display captured rats, or transport ferrets. Its smell was notorious, a mix of straw, fur, and decay. Some rat catchers wore belts with hooks and loops from which hung cages, knives, or small nets. Their appearance, laden with tools and animals, made them unmistakable figures in the marketplace, a traveling arsenal against vermin. The cane or stick was both weapon and symbol, used to prod into holes, strike at fleeing rats, or control dogs. It was also a sign of authority, much like the staff of a plague doctor. Some sticks were sharpened at the end for stabbing, others fitted with hooks for lifting boards. In taverns or markets, the rat catcher's stick also served as defense, for not everyone welcomed his presence. His trade carried stigma, and the smell of his sacks often made him unwelcome company. Yet the stick marked him as a man apart, equipped for both vermin and confrontation. Notebooks and tallies, though less glamorous, were also tools of the trade. Many towns required evidence of work, counts of rats caught, lists of houses treated, or records of payments. Some rat catchers prided themselves on detailed notes, sketching trap designs, or recording which baits proved most effective. These humble documents, when they survive, give us glimpses into the practical knowledge of men whose craft was otherwise rarely written down. The rat catcher's tools extended beyond objects to his senses and skills. Sharp hearing to detect scratching in walls, patience to wait silently by a burrow, quick reflexes to seize a fleeing rat. All were as essential as cages or poisons. His nose became attuned to the smell of infestation, his eyes trained to notice droppings or gnaw marks. These human tools, honed by experience, gave him an edge where others saw only shadows. Public displays of his tools reinforced his reputation. In some towns, rat catchers were required to show the bodies of the rats they had killed, dumping them in piles before officials as proof of service. Their sacks spilled onto the cobblestones, a grim but necessary accounting. Crowds gathered, children pointed, merchants nodded with relief. These displays were both evidence and theater, the rat catcher demonstrating his power over vermin with tools as his props that, of course, the tools did not make the man welcome. The smell of his sacks, the sight of bloodied dogs, the rumors of poison, these made him a figure both needed and shunned. Yet his toolkit symbolized his craft. Each object spoke of resourcefulness, of a life lived in alleys and cellars, of work that touched the hidden underbelly of the town. Without his traps, dogs, ferrets, poisons, sacks, and sticks, the rat catcher was just another poor laborer. With them, he became something both feared and relied upon. The tools of the trade remind us that even the oddest professions are shaped by the materials of their time. Just as smiths had their hammers and bakers their ovens, the rat catcher had his traps, sacks, and dogs. In their clumsy wood and leather, in their sharp iron and pungent herbs, we see the daily battle between humans and vermin, a battle fought not with grandeur, but with grit. The rat catcher's tools, his traps, dogs, ferrets, and poisons, were the visible side of his profession. Yet no tool is effective without the skill of the hand that uses it. What truly set the rat catcher apart were the tricks he learned through long experience, the methods of luring, the rhythms of patience, the uncanny knowledge of where vermin lived and how they moved. These tricks, half science and half instinct, were the heart of his trade. Without them, the tools were little more than wood, iron, and fur. One of the most important tricks was baiting. Rats were clever and cautious, avoiding unfamiliar scents. A trap left untouched in a barn was useless unless it tempted the vermin inside. Rat catchers learned to smear traps with grease or fat, disguising the smell of human hands. They experimented with baits, crumbs of bread, bits of dried fish, cheese rind, or even roasted grain. Some swore by the use of rancid butter, others by dripping a trail of oil that led into the trap. The art was not in setting the mechanism, but in convincing the rat to trust it. Patience was another essential trick. Rats seldom rushed headlong into danger. They tested new objects with cautious nibbles, circling before committing. A skilled rat catcher might leave a trap unset for several nights, letting rats grow accustomed to feeding inside. Only when the vermin were comfortable did he trigger the mechanism. To the townsfolk eager for quick results, this seemed slow. But the rat catcher knew that rushing cost more than waiting. His trade was one of timing, of learning when to strike. Observation formed the third cornerstone of his craft. The rat catcher could walk into a granary and, within minutes, know whether it was infested. He studied droppings on the floor, gnaw marks on sacks, smears of grease along walls where rats brushed as they ran. He noted holes at the base of barrels, pathways traced in dust, faint scratching behind boards. These signs spoke to him as clearly as words. Townspeople might see only clutter. He saw a map of vermin life. Following these clues, he placed his traps and nets with uncanny precision. Secrecy was also part of his tricks. Rat catchers often guarded their methods jealously, passing them only to apprentices or family members. Recipes for poisons were kept hidden, baiting techniques whispered rather than written. This secrecy added to their mystique. Townspeople speculated that rat catchers had magical powers, that they whistled charms to summon vermin, or that they carried powders with mysterious properties. In truth, most of their tricks were practical knowledge honed through years of trial. But secrecy gave them authority, turning experience into reputation. Ferret handling required its own tricks. Rats, cornered by a ferret in their tunnels, could fight fiercely. A poorly trained ferret might be injured or even killed. The rat catcher learned to block escape holes, to guide the ferret's movement, to listen for the sounds of scurrying that signaled prey on the run. Timing was critical. Nets had to be ready, dogs prepared, traps open. The trick lay in orchestrating the chaos, turning the panic of vermin into capture rather than confusion. Another subtle trick was psychological, managing the expectations of townsfolk. Rat catchers often worked for councils or merchants who wanted visible proof of success. Piles of dead rats, displayed in public squares, served this purpose. Yet not every infestation could be solved overnight. The rat catcher sometimes saved a few corpses from one job to add to the pile at another, ensuring his reputation remained strong. This was not deception so much as theater, for the public demanded spectacle as much as results. Dogs, too, required tricks and training. Terriers needed to distinguish between vermin and livestock, to hunt swiftly without damaging goods. Rat catchers trained them with repetition, rewarding each successful kill, teaching them to respond to whistles or hand signals. Some dogs became famous in their own right, known in towns for their ferocity and speed. A skilled rat catcher with a clever dog was a feared and respected duo, capable of clearing barns in a single afternoon. Poison demanded careful tricks as well. Too strong a mixture, and rats avoided it. Too weak, and they survived. The rat catcher learned to balance bitterness with bait, to scatter poison in ways that seemed natural rather than contrived. He often tested small amounts, watching the vermin's reaction, adjusting the recipe until it worked. Success was measured not in theory, but in silence, the absence of scratching at night, the stillness of a storeroom once alive with movement. Perhaps the most curious trick was the rat catcher's ability to predict infestations. He knew that after floods, when rubbish piled in corners, rats multiplied. He noticed that ships docking in harbor often carried new swarms, spreading quickly into towns. He observed that famine drove vermin from fields into granaries. These insights allowed him to anticipate work, arriving before others realized the scale of the problem. To the townsfolk, it seemed as though he had a sixth sense. In truth, it was careful observation woven into experience. There were darker tricks as well. Some whispered that dishonest rat catchers released rats into towns to secure future employment. While evidence for this is scarce, the suspicion lingered, showing how uneasy society felt about men who dealt so closely with vermin. The line between control and manipulation was thin, and the rat catcher's secrecy made him vulnerable to rumors. His trade was always shadowed by mistrust. Even when his tricks brought genuine relief to its heart, the rat catcher's craft was a blend of patience, observation, and cunning. His tricks transformed simple tools into effective weapons. A wooden box became a trap only when baited with skill. A dog became a hunter only when trained with care. A sack of herbs became poison only when mixed in the right measure. These tricks were not written in books, not taught in schools, but lived in the hands and minds of men who made their living in shadows. The towns that hired rat catchers may not have understood the details of these tricks, but they respected their results. When granaries grew quiet, when markets lost the sound of scurrying feet, when children slept without scratching noises in the walls, people gave grudging thanks. The tricks of the trade, invisible yet effective, sustained the balance between townsfolk and the vermin that lived among them. In the end, the rat catcher's greatest trick was survival itself, making a living from one of the most unpleasant tasks imaginable, finding dignity in a trade others scorned, and transforming cunning into livelihood. His craft was not glamorous, but it was real, and his tricks, however simple, shaped the daily life of towns in ways we too easily forget. The life of a rat catcher may sound like an odd curiosity, a trade half hidden in the shadows of medieval and early modern towns. But for the men who practiced it, the work was not only strange, but also dangerous. Each day brought risks to their health, their reputation, and sometimes even their lives. The hazards of the rat catcher's job reveal much about the world in which they lived. A world where vermin were not simply nuisances, but genuine threats to survival, and where those who fought them bore the burdens of filth, disease, and suspicion. The most obvious hazard was physical. Rats were small but fierce when cornered. Their teeth could bite deep, and their claws tore flesh with surprising ease. A single rat was bad enough, but infestations often meant dozens or even hundreds in a confined space. A rat catcher reaching into a burrow, overturning a sack of grain, or prying up floorboards risked sudden swarms rushing out in panic. In such moments, the air filled with squealing and the floor seemed to ripple with movement. Rats leapt at hands, legs, even faces. Bites were frequent, scratches unavoidable, and infections common. In an age without antibiotics, even a small wound could fester, swelling painfully and sometimes leading to death. Beyond bites, there were the diseases rats carried. Though medieval and early modern townspeople did not know about bacteria, they recognized that vermin and illness were often linked. Fleas that lived on rats transmitted plague, and lice carried fevers. Rat catchers, constantly handling their prey, were exposed daily. Their clothes absorbed the smell of vermin. Their skin bore the marks of infestations. Some tried to protect themselves with gloves, vinegar washes, or smoke, but these were imperfect defenses. To be a rat catcher was to live with constant risk of sickness, a danger that claimed many quietly, without record. The hazards were not only bodily, but also environmental. Rat catchers worked in places few others dared enter: damp cellars, refuse heaps, dark attics, abandoned houses. These spaces were filled with mold, rot, and foul air. The floors were slick with waste, the walls unstable. A misstep could mean a fall, a collapse, or injury from hidden nails and splinters. Fires and lanterns added their own risks, for in dark barns filled with hay, one careless spark could cause disaster. In chasing rats, the rat catcher walked daily through the filthiest corners of his town. His dogs and ferrets, though invaluable allies, carried hazards of their own. Dogs could be injured in the hunt, bitten or scratched as they seized vermin. Ferrets could turn on their masters if handled roughly or neglected. A rat catcher who relied too heavily on his animals risked losing them in moments of chaos. Training required care, and mishandling often led to wounds. The bond between man and beast was strong, but it was also fraught with dangers shared in the hunt. The use of poisons presented further hazards. Arsenic, quicklime, and other substances could kill rats, but they could also kill humans if misapplied. Rat catchers mixing their powders often inhaled fumes, spilled onto their skin, or carried traces back to their homes. Accidental poisonings were not uncommon, whether of pets, livestock, or children who discovered bait. Councils sometimes punished rat catchers for such accidents, blaming them for carelessness or negligence. Thus, every use of poison balanced effectiveness with danger, not only for the rats, but for the entire community. Social hazards were equally real. The rat catcher's trade placed him on the margins of respectability. Townspeople needed his skills, but looked down upon his work. He was associated with filth, disease, and death. Children mocked him, adults avoided his company, and guilds rarely welcomed him. Suspicion sometimes turned to hostility. If illness spread despite his efforts, he could be accused of failure, or worse, of causing the problem himself. Whispers circulated that rat catchers released vermin to ensure future employment, that their secret whistles summoned rats as easily as they drove them away. Whether true or not, such rumors damaged reputations and sometimes put men at risk of violence. Economic hazards added to the strain. Rat catchers often worked by contract, paid per head of vermin caught or per job completed. If rats evaded their traps, their income faltered. Bad seasons of famine or war meant fewer payments and greater risks. Some tried to supplement earnings by selling rat skins or providing live rats for dog baiting contests. But these side trades were themselves dangerous, drawing criticism or exposing them further to disease. Poverty was a constant shadow, and many rat catchers lived hand to mouth, their lives as precarious as those they hunted. The emotional hazards of the trade must not be overlooked. To spend one's days among filth and vermin, to hear the constant squeals of rats, to smell their stench, and to know that most townspeople shunned you. This weighed heavily. Rat catchers lived with isolation, their reputations marked by disgust. Even when successful, their victories were quiet, quickly forgotten, overshadowed by the endless tide of vermin that always returned. The psychological toll of fighting an unending battle, one never fully won, left many weary and hardened. Yet perhaps the greatest hazard was invisibility. Unlike craftsmen who left behind durable products, iron tools, woven cloth, carved wood, the rat catcher left no tangible legacy. His work was measured in absences, the grain not eaten, the food not spoiled, the rats not seen. When he succeeded, he was forgotten. When he failed, he was blamed. To live in such a trade was to accept thanklessness as part of one's lot. Despite these hazards, men continued to take up the trade. Some were born into it, apprenticing under fathers or uncles. Others turned to it out of desperation, finding in vermin a livelihood no one else desired. The hazards were many, but so too was the need. As long as towns had grain, waste, and walls, rats thrived. And as long as rats thrived, someone had to chase them, no matter the danger. The hazards of the rat catcher's job, then, reflect more than his personal struggles. They mirror the conditions of medieval and early modern towns, the filth, the disease, the precariousness of survival. His wounds and sicknesses were part of the wider fabric of urban life, woven into the risks everyone faced but few confronted so directly. By enduring them, the rat catcher carried burdens on behalf of his community, though seldom thanked, often mistrusted, and always at risk. In this way, his hazards were not only personal but civic. Each bite, each scratch, each rumor borne against him was part of the price society paid for the uneasy coexistence with vermin. His trade may seem odd, even grotesque, but it was born from necessity, and its dangers remind us of the fragility of urban life in an age without modern sanitation. The rat catcher lived at the edge of his community, never entirely trusted, seldom entirely rejected. His trade placed him among vermin, and so, in the eyes of his neighbors, part of that shadow clung to him as well. Reputation was as much a burden as rats themselves, for a man's name could weigh heavier than the sack he carried. And over the centuries, as townsfolk watched him at work, whispered about his methods, and invented stories to explain what they did not understand, folklore gathered around him like dust in the corners he cleaned. Reputation in daily life was double-edged. On one hand, the rat catcher was necessary. When barns were gnawed hollow, when ships arrived with infested cargo, when markets echoed with the squeals of vermin, people called for him without hesitation. His skills saved grain, preserved meat, and kept taverns from being overrun. His trade was the difference between survival and ruin. In these moments, he was acknowledged with respect, his presence a relief that, on the other hand, when the work was done, respect quickly turned to unease. His clothes bore the smell of filth. His hands carried scratches and bites. Mothers warned children not to follow him too closely. Merchants paid him swiftly, but ushered him away. His reputation was tainted by association. Like the executioner or the tanner, he handled what others preferred to ignore. This ambiguity, needed yet shunned, shaped the stories told about him. Folklore gave shape to the mystery. Townsfolk did not fully understand how the rat catcher found vermin with such accuracy, or why his poisons worked when others failed. They whispered that he possessed secret charms or whistles that summoned rats at will. Some claimed he could command swarms as easily as he destroyed them, leading vermin out of barns like a shepherd with his flock. Others suggested darker bargains, that he bred rats in secret, releasing them into towns to guarantee his employment. These suspicions, though often unfounded, reveal the unease his profession inspired. Legends blurred the line between fact and tale. The most famous example is the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which likely grew from memories of itinerant rat catchers. In the tale, a stranger promised to rid the town of rats by playing his pipe. When the townsfolk refused to pay, he led their children away instead. Though embellished over centuries, the story reflects familiar fears that the rat catcher, with his strange skills, could just as easily harm as help. Whether by music, whistle, or secret trick, he was imagined as a man whose powers lay beyond ordinary comprehension. Songs and rhymes also carried his image. Children made verses about rat catcher's sacks, chanting lines that mocked his smell or his supposed magic. In taverns, men told stories of rat catchers outwitted by their prey, or of those who died from their own poisons. These tales entertained, but also reinforced social boundaries. They reminded listeners that while the rat catcher's work was useful, he remained a figure apart, strange, risky, and never quite trustworthy. His reputation extended into morality. Because rats were linked with greed, gluttony, and filth, the rat catcher was sometimes seen as tainted by these qualities. Preachers warned that to consort too closely with vermin was to risk becoming like them. Yet at the same time, some saw in his trade a symbolic role. He cleansed the town of its pests, as confession cleansed the soul of sin. Folklore played with both images, turning him alternately into a figure of corruption and a figure of purification. Superstition clung stubbornly. Rat catchers sometimes carried herbs, charms, or small relics, both as personal protection and as part of their trade. Townsfolk, seeing this, assumed they dealt in magic. A whistle might be taken for an incantation, a pouch of poison mistaken for sorcery. In communities where unseen forces were often blamed for misfortune, the rat catcher easily became suspect. He walked a fine line, tolerated for his usefulness but mistrusted for his supposed secrets. Reputation also varied by region. In bustling cities, where infestations were constant, rat catchers might be seen more pragmatically as necessary workers. In smaller towns and villages, where his visits were rarer, he could appear almost uncanny, a traveler who arrived, dealt with vermin, and vanished. In such places, folklore flourished most vividly, filling gaps in knowledge with invention. The less people saw of his daily labor, the more mysterious it seemed. Even when not shaped by legend, his reputation was colored by spectacle. Public displays of dead rats, poured from sacks onto cobblestones, were both proof of service and performance. Crowds gathered, children stared, merchants calculated savings, and in that moment the rat catcher stood in the center of attention. Yet once the bodies were counted, the spectacle ended, and with it any respect. The man who had been briefly celebrated returned to his usual place at the margins, carrying away his sacks and his odor. Over generations, this pattern left its mark. The rat catcher became a liminal figure in cultural memory, necessary but distrusted, real but surrounded by myth. His reputation was shaped as much by stories as by reality, his trade woven into folklore until the man and the myth could not be separated. He was imagined as trickster, sorcerer, hero, villain, whatever role the community needed to explain its unease that I in the end. The folklore of the rat catcher tells us less about the man himself than about the society that created it. Towns needed to make sense of the strange figure who walked their alleys with sacks and ferrets, who dealt daily with vermin yet claimed to control them. Stories gave shape to uncertainty, turning suspicion into tale, unease into rhyme. And so the rat catcher lives on, not only in the records of councils who paid his wages, but in the whispers and legends of ordinary people who never quite knew whether to thank him or fear him. Though most rat catchers lived and died in obscurity, their names quickly forgotten once their sacks were emptied and their contracts ended. A few became the subjects of story, memory, and legend. Some gained fame because their skills were extraordinary, others because their failures were dramatic, and still others because folklore transformed them into larger-than-life figures. To explore these tales is to glimpse how society remembered its oddest servants, with exaggeration, with suspicion, and sometimes with admiration. Perhaps the most enduring legend connected to rat catchers is the tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. First recorded in the late Middle Ages, the story tells of a stranger who arrived in the German town of Hamelin, promising to rid it of rats. With the music of his pipe, he lured vermin from houses and cellars, leading them to the river where they drowned. When the townspeople refused to pay, he turned his music on their children, who followed him away, never to return. Over centuries, the tale grew into myth, retold in poems, songs, and children's books. The Pied Piper was not a real rat catcher in the sense of traps and poisons, but the story reflects deep cultural anxieties. Townspeople feared that the rat catcher's mysterious skills could as easily be turned against them as for them. They respected his ability to banish vermin, but mistrusted the secrets of how it was done. The legend distilled that unease into narrative. The man who removed pests could remove children too. Thus, one of the world's most famous folktales reveals the tension between gratitude and suspicion that always surrounded the profession. Other names surface in fragments of history. In 17th century London, a rat catcher named Jack Black became notorious for his flamboyant style. Dressed in a showman's coat, with a belt full of cages and ferrets, he worked not only in cellars and warehouses, but also in public exhibitions. He sold live rats for sporting contests, where terriers were pitted against dozens of vermin before tavern audiences. His reputation spread through gossip and print, making him more than a tradesman. He was a performer, turning pest control into spectacle. His life blurred the line between necessity and entertainment, a reminder that some rat catchers sought fame as well as survival done on the continent. Records tell of itinerant rat catchers who traveled from town to town, their reputation preceding them. In France, certain men were said to possess secret powders that drove rats from barns overnight. In Italy, stories circulated of rat catchers who worked with trained cats and dogs in coordinated hunts, parading their animals through streets like small armies. These tales may have been embellished, but they show how skill in the trade could elevate a man's status from marginal laborer to figure of renown. Some legends carry a darker tone. In Central Europe, whispers told of rat catchers who deliberately released vermin into towns to secure future employment. They became figures of suspicion, accused of creating the very problems they claimed to solve. Whether these accusations were ever true is uncertain, but the stories reveal a cultural fear that a man with power over vermin could wield it dishonestly. The idea that a rat catcher might secretly command swarms gave him an almost sorcerous image, blending reality with superstition that in rural folklore. Rat catchers sometimes became trickster figures. Stories describe them outwitting greedy landlords by turning rats loose in barns, or winning wagers by clearing houses in impossible times. In such tales, they were not villains but clever commoners, using their knowledge of vermin to humble the powerful. These legends echo broader traditions of folk heroes who survived through cunning rather than strength, reflecting admiration for the odd but resourceful tradesmen. Even failures became part of their fame. Chronicles mention occasions when rat catchers promised too much, claiming to rid a town of all vermin, only for rats to return in force weeks later. Such men were mocked, their reputations destroyed, their names remembered in jest. These failures reinforced the sense that rat catchers walked a precarious line between miracle worker and charlatan. Their fame always fragile that by the 18th and 19th centuries. As cities grew and sanitation improved, the figure of the rat catcher began to change. Newspapers occasionally published stories of men who cleared entire ships of vermin or who claimed to know secret poisons. Some were celebrated as curiosities, their portraits engraved alongside their dogs and tools. Others became comic characters in plays and pamphlets, exaggerated into grotesque figures whose sacks overflowed endlessly. The legends shifted with the times, but the fascination remained. What unites these stories, whether of the Pied Piper, Jack Black, itinerant Frenchman, or nameless tricksters, is the sense that the rat catcher was never ordinary. His work was too strange, too close to the filth others avoided, too wrapped in secrecy to leave him a simple tradesman. Folklore inflated him into villain, hero, or magician, depending on what society needed to express. In this way, rat catchers achieved a kind of fame that outlasted their lives, living on in tales long after the last sack of vermin was emptied. Thus, the famous rat catchers and their legends remind us that history is not made only of kings and battles, but also of men in shadowed streets, chasing squealing vermin. Their stories reflect both the practical struggles of towns and the imaginative responses of people seeking to explain them. They stand as figures half real, half mythical, guardians of granaries, subjects of satire, and characters in tales that continue to echo through the centuries. Every profession is shaped not only by the needs of its time, but also by the limits of its age. The rat catcher, who once strode through medieval towns with sacks, traps, dogs, and ferrets, lived in a world where vermin seemed impossible to conquer entirely. His trade flourished because rats were constant companions in homes, barns, ships, and marketplaces. Yet by the 19th and 20th centuries, the profession began to fade. What had once been a peculiar but necessary trade slowly declined, replaced by new systems of sanitation, science, and urban order. To trace the decline of the rat catcher is to witness how changing societies transformed their relationship with both vermin and those who hunted them. The roots of decline lay first in urban reform. As towns grew into cities, pressure mounted to clean streets, improve drainage, and control waste. 19th century Europe, scarred by outbreaks of cholera and plagued by overcrowding, turned to engineers and reformers. Sewers were constructed, rubbish collection organized, and housing regulations tightened. Where once refuse heaps had served as breeding grounds for rats, municipal services now carried waste away. These improvements did not eliminate rats, but they reduced the scale of infestations dramatically. With fewer rats in public view, the need for professional catchers diminished at the same time. Advances in science reshaped understanding of disease. The germ theory of the 19th century replaced older notions of miasma. Scientists like Pasteur and Koch demonstrated that illness came not from bad air, but from microbes. In this light, the rat became more than a thief of grain. It became a carrier of pathogens. Fleas on rats were recognized as transmitters of plague, and rat control shifted from an odd job to a public health strategy. The task moved into the hands of trained officials, backed by laboratories and government programs, leaving less space for the independent tradesman with his sack and ferrets. Poisons, too, became more sophisticated. Where medieval rat catchers had relied on crude mixtures of herbs and minerals, modern chemistry provided potent rodenticides. Arsenic was refined, strychnine employed, and later compounds developed that could be spread across wide areas. These substances, dangerous though they were, offered a level of efficiency no single rat catcher could match. Municipal authorities preferred to hire teams armed with poison rather than rely on individuals. The craft knowledge of baiting and trapping, once closely guarded secrets, was increasingly replaced by chemical solutions. The rise of professional pest control companies accelerated the decline. By the late 19th century, businesses advertised their services in newspapers, promising efficient, modern, and scientific eradication of vermin. These firms employed workers trained in uniform methods, offering guarantees that itinerant rat catchers could not. The image of the lone man with a sack gave way to the office with contracts, invoices, and printed pamphlets. Pest control became an industry rather than a craft, and with that shift, the figure of the traditional rat catcher began to vanish. Social attitudes played their part. In earlier centuries, the rat catcher had always carried stigma, tolerated but never embraced. As cities sought to present themselves as modern, respectable, and orderly, such figures no longer fit the image. A man reeking of vermin, carrying cages of squealing rats, seemed an embarrassment rather than a civic necessity. He belonged to a dirtier past that reformers wanted to leave behind. The decline of his trade was therefore not only practical but also symbolic, a marker of urban progress, proof that filth and disorder were being conquered. Entertainment, once a sideline of the rat catcher, also fell away. Dog ratting contests in taverns, where terriers killed vermin for sport, were increasingly condemned as cruel and unsanitary. Laws against animal baiting, passed in the 19th century, stripped rat catchers of an additional source of income and spectacle. Without this public display, their visibility diminished further, and their role shrank quietly into obscurity. The industrial age brought new challenges that further marginalized the rat catcher. Ships and railways carried vermin faster and farther than ever before, requiring coordinated control measures at ports and stations. National governments, not local rat catchers, took responsibility for these problems. Campaigns against plague in Asia, against rodents in grain depots, and against infestations in cities relied on officials with budgets and authority. The lone tradesman, once the hero of alleys and barns, had little place in this bureaucratic order. By the early 20th century, the rat catcher had largely disappeared as a formal occupation. His tools, wooden traps, ferrets, sacks, were replaced by mass-produced devices, poisons, and municipal workers. Where he survived, it was often As a curiosity in rural areas, a man who kept up the old ways more from tradition than necessity. Occasionally, his figure appeared in newspapers or novels, remembered as a relic of a dirtier past. But as cities grew cleaner and science advanced, his profession dwindled into memory. Yet decline did not mean erasure. The image of the rat catcher lingered in folklore, literature, and popular culture. The Pied Piper story, already centuries old, continued to be retold in new forms, ensuring that the figure of the man who dealt with rats never entirely vanished. In children's books, songs, and plays, the rat catcher survived as legend even as his real trade disappeared. His odd place in memory reflects both nostalgia for a vanished world and fascination with the grotesque. The decline of the rat catcher reminds us that history is shaped by change as much as by continuity. His disappearance was not sudden but gradual, stretched across centuries as cities cleaned themselves, science advanced, and society redefined respectability. What was once necessary became outdated. What was once tolerated became unacceptable. Yet in that process, the rat catcher left behind more than dead vermin. He left behind a memory of how people once lived in closer company with filth, how they relied on odd trades to preserve their fragile order, and how progress gradually shifted the boundaries of necessity. Thus, the story of the rat catcher's decline is not one of failure, but of transformation. His trade faded because society changed, because urban life became less hospitable to vermin and less tolerant of the men who hunted them. The decline marks a victory of sorts: cleaner streets, healthier towns, fewer infestations. But it also leaves a gap in memory, a reminder that the odd jobs of the past were once essential, and that behind every change in society lie the forgotten labors of men who worked in shadows. By the time the traditional rat catcher's trade had declined, his figure had already escaped the limits of daily life and entered the realm of memory. No longer a man trudging through damp cellars with ferrets and sacks, he became instead a character in stories, songs, and recollections. His profession, once so practical and dirty, transformed into something symbolic, remembered less for what it achieved than for what it represented. Folklore had shaped him for centuries, and when the trade itself faded, memory carried him forward. Folklore had always surrounded the rat catcher. Townspeople, uncertain of how he managed his craft, filled gaps in knowledge with stories of whistles that summoned vermin or powders that drove them away. His sack became an object of curiosity, his ferrets creatures of superstition. When he vanished from streets, those stories did not vanish with him. Instead, they grew stronger, polished in retelling, passed from parents to children as glimpses of a vanished world. Memory worked in layers. In some families, recollections of real encounters with rat catchers lingered. Grandparents recalled the smell of his bag, the squealing of his trapped vermin, the quick snap of his traps. These memories, carried across generations, kept the figure alive in small ways. At the same time, written accounts, contracts, chronicles, pamphlets preserved traces of his labor, giving later historians material from which to reconstruct his role. Between oral tales and written fragments, the rat catcher lived on, half real and half imagined. Folklore often exaggerated his powers. The Pied Piper story, though only loosely connected to real rat catchers, became one of the most famous folktales of Europe. Its themes of betrayal, punishment, and uncanny skill captured the fears people had long held toward men who dealt with vermin. The rat catcher became not just a tradesman, but a trickster, a magician, a figure capable of commanding creatures beyond the control of ordinary people. The story spread across languages, shaping how countless generations imagined the profession. Literature further expanded his memory. In 19th century England, writers described flamboyant figures like Jack Black, who styled himself as rat catcher to Queen Victoria. His colorful clothing, his trained dogs, and his theatrical hunts turned the profession into spectacle. Though exaggerated in newspapers and memoirs, his stories cemented the idea that rat catchers were both peculiar and fascinating. Fictional works borrowed from such accounts, portraying rat catchers as shady figures in alleyways or eccentric characters in novels. Art contributed to this transformation. Illustrations of rat catchers, whether in satirical prints or children's books, gave shape to memory. Engravers emphasized their sacks, their ferrets, their bent postures. Painters sometimes cast them as symbols of poverty or grotesque survivals of an older world. Each image fixed certain details: dogs snapping at vermin, men holding out traps, crowds watching in curiosity, until the rat catcher became more archetype than individual. Even popular entertainment played a role. In the 19th century, rat baiting contests were remembered in stories and songs long after they were banned. Rat catchers who had once provided live vermin for such spectacles were recalled as part of a rougher, rowdier past. Music hall performers parodied them, turning the odd job into comic song. Audiences laughed, but in laughing they remembered in rural communities, where folklore remained strong, the rat catcher merged with local superstition. Stories told of him as a man who could curse a farm with vermin if unpaid, or who could lift such a curse with his charms. These tales may have had little basis in fact, but they reveal how memory absorbed the rat catcher into older traditions of cunning men, hedge wizards, and tricksters. By the 20th century, when few had ever seen a real rat catcher at work, these folkloric versions were often the only ones people knew. Historians, too, played their part in preserving his memory. Curious about forgotten traits, scholars in the 20th century began to collect records of rat catchers, publishing accounts of their contracts, tools, and legends. Museums displayed their traps, their sacks, their ferret cages, sometimes alongside the broader history of urban sanitation. Visitors peered at these relics with fascination, surprised that such a peculiar profession had once been not only real but necessary. The memory of the rat catcher also reflects a broader human tendency to remember the odd and the grotesque more vividly than the ordinary. Blacksmiths and bakers were essential too, but they blended into the fabric of daily life. The rat catcher stood out precisely because his work was strange, his presence unsettling. Folklore seized on those qualities, exaggerating them, and memory carried them forward. The very oddness that once earned him suspicion guaranteed his survival in imagination. In this way, the rat catcher's journey from reality to memory mirrors that of other marginal figures: the plague doctor with his bird mask, the executioner with his axe, the tanner with his vats. All were needed, all were shunned, and all became larger than life in story once their trades faded. The rat catcher joined this company, a symbol of society's uncomfortable but necessary relationship with filth and death. Today, when his figure appears, it is rarely as a real tradesman. Instead, it surfaces in children's stories, in local legends, in historical curiosities. His memory is more symbolic than practical, reminding us of a time when urban life was more precarious, when survival depended on odd jobs carried out in shadows. From folklore to memory, the rat catcher persists, not in streets filled with squeals, but in the quiet corners of cultural imagination. Thus, his decline did not erase him. Instead, it transformed him. No longer a man with traps and dogs, he became a memory with meaning. His trade, once grim and uncelebrated, survives now as a reminder of resilience, of ingenuity, and of the strange ways society has always coped with the vermin that lived beside it. The rat catcher was never a celebrated figure, yet his shadow fell across every medieval and early modern town. With his sack, his ferrets, his dogs, and his traps, he entered the corners of life others avoided. His work was dirty, his reputation uneasy, and yet without him, vermin would have consumed grain, spoiled food, and spread fear unchecked. He was both needed and shunned, a man whose labor left no monuments, but whose presence shaped the survival of communities. Over time, his trade declined as sanitation improved, science advanced, and cities reshaped themselves. Yet the memory of the rat catcher did not vanish. Instead, it slipped into folklore, legend, and story. From the grim spectacle of piled rats in town squares to the haunting tale of the Pied Piper, his image endured. He became a figure half real, half mythical, part tradesman, part trickster, part warning from the past. The lesson of the rat catcher lies not only in the oddness of his trade, but in what it reveals about daily life. History is built not just by rulers and battles, but also by the quiet, strange, and overlooked work of ordinary people. The rat catcher's world reminds us of a time when life was fragile, when survival depended on small trades carried out in shadows, and when society relied on those willing to do what others would not. As you rest tonight, imagine the silence of a medieval street broken by the faint squeak of cages and the patter of small terriers. Somewhere in the half-light, a man carries his sack, his step steady, his figure fading into alleyways. Odd, necessary, and unforgettable, he walks on, not only through history, but through memory itself. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this calm journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more gentle stories of history. Good night.